Welcome to the Build on Beauty podcast, where beauty is born skin deep. Now, here's your host, author, speaker, entrepreneur, Cornell Jermaine.
Thank you all so much for joining me here. We have a special guest. He is the former professor in the School of Social Work and the Department of Psychiatry at the University of Michigan School of Medicine, and is currently the professor of social development at Brown School of Washington University in St. Louis. Please help me welcome, on the subject of homicide and suicide in urban communities, Dr. Sean Joe. Dr. Joe, how are you today?
I'm doing well. Thank you very much. I wanted to appreciate the wonderful bio. So we're here at the Brown School, and I'm a professor here of social work and social development.
Okay, very good. And that's in St. Louis, correct?
Yes, Washington University in St. Louis.
Wow, so good. Tell us, since we're speaking on that, give us just a little insight into the work you've done over the course of your career.
So my work really began first with looking at homicide, youth homicide in Chicago, looking at those broader structural factors that I think neighborhood structures and how they relate to patterns and trends in homicide, really trying to make the argument that homicide is just not an individual level issue, meaning that it's not just the characteristics of those individuals, but also structures, neighborhoods, facilitate or promote certain sort of behaviors. And what we saw in Chicago over many, many decades, since the 1920s and up, that the same neighborhoods, as the population changed, the patterns of crime and other issues and health and poor health outcomes are prevalent in the same neighborhoods, regardless of the ethnic composition of the people in those neighborhoods. And so it really indicated that it's often much more about the poverty, the lack of resources, and less about the individuals and their moral values. And you saw that over decades and decades of the same neighborhoods in Chicago. Then the work moved forward in terms of really understanding the patterns of suicide among Black Americans, only because, again, I saw this was an understudied area, and I wanted to know whether or not young Black males in particular who are at high risk for homicide also are they at high risk for suicide. And one of the thinking at the time was that suicide and homicide are opposites of the same coin. That's why I really wanted to ask that question. And we saw that there was a rise in suicide among young Black teenagers, but the work hasn't been looked at for a while. So I began in the 90s really looking at that again and expanding that to understand the psychiatric health of Black Americans, and it confirmed again the need for continued work around suicide prevention. So that's been the second phase of my work, and that work continues. And right now I'm focused on not just answering those questions related to suicide prevention, but I'm really focused now on how do you take all this knowledge, collective wisdom and knowledge, across multiple disciplines and multiple individuals to support the social mobility of Black males. And how do you do that at the population level, meaning how do you change those outcomes to large neighborhoods so that those neighborhoods become one that facilitates positive outcomes versus us studying over decades the same neighborhoods and seeing negative outcomes. How do you change that context?
As it pertains to homicides, what are some of the data specifically showing in regards to that?
Well, I mean, homicide, again, although it's still a leading cause of death for young Black males, though homicide rates have come down, we have many cities that are still beset by large levels of violence, particularly that's impacting males and their families, that we have large numbers of families and friends whose trauma associated with this loss and life or death goes unattended for the most part. And we're now barely beginning to find those who have an interest to be able to say, not only is the homicide happens, but what happens to the people who've experienced that, the families, the friends, and to take a human interest in that. So we have scholars who are beginning to advance that work, like Jocelyn Smith or Tanya Sharp, different scholars who are taking up that mantle. So those are some of the things I still understand around youth homicide. But again, at this point, it's the self-destructive behaviors, the suicide that I'm more focused on now.
One of the things that interests me regarding the suicide is that I think some of the data has shown that many blacks, and particularly young blacks, 35 and under, are the highest risk. What is that true? And if so, why do you think that is?
Well, actually, that's been consistent that when it comes to suicide among black Americans, it's always the youngest that are at high risk. And there are several ways to think about that my work has begun to show. Well, one, you got to understand there are different generational differences in terms of suicidal behavior, in terms of the attitudes towards suicidal behavior. There are different generational differences in terms of mental health and the importance of seeking care for mental illness. That begins to try to explain some of this. But more important, I just think is that the context in which younger black Americans are growing up in begins to mirror the context and experiences of young white Americans, which makes them more susceptible to internalize their experiences more so than older black Americans. And if you internalize your experiences more, you're at higher risk for onset of depression and anxiety and factors that we know that correlates high with actual suicidal behavior and suicide in the long run. So basically what I'm saying, there's been a change in multiple factors, because suicide you cannot narrow down to one thing. It's multiple factors. So we have to have an understanding that there's a psychologist who did some work back in 1938 out of Howard University. This was one of the first published works on suicidal behavior, and he said it then, and it's still true now. As black Americans begin to experience America like white Americans, their rates of suicides are going to go up, meaning that our framework, although rich as a nation for innovation and creativity, also leaves us, as Lonnie Guinier had once said, that if the American dream only has one explanation for failure, and that is that you deserve your lot in life. And if that is the way people interpret their world and are not able to see any structural factors that impact their lives or that are determining some of the outcomes, they're more likely to blame themselves and to hold that blame, which increases their chances of being at risk for psychiatric disorders, and then, again, factors that relate to suicidal behavior. So it's a complex explanation. I'm sorry to your listeners for that, but it gives you a sense that the developmental context is very different from older blacks to younger blacks, and that's part of this challenge.
And I can see how that can be so complex. One thing that's really, I guess, striking to me is the amount of suicide we've seen in young grade children here lately.
Yeah.
Do you have any, and I know it kind of comes from cyberbullying and probably other things, but is there anything you can offer in regards to that?
No, I think the fact that we saw, in a recent analysis in 2015 that black children under the ages of 12, right, are showing more suicides than white children. So again, this is what we were concerned about, that each generation are becoming much more suicidal in terms of risk. And again, you must put this in context. One, suicide is still a rare phenomenon, although we have 40,000 people who die a year. Every life is important to save. What we're concerned about is not the large number, but the idea that we have to find ways to intervene and support our young children. This is critical. What is it about the experiences of growing up that would make any person, much less a youth, a child under 12, to feel that life is not worth living? Now, granted, some of those suicides can be impulsive because, again, suicide tends to be an impulsive behavior, that these young people might be mad or angry or sad, and we have to find a way to reach out to those babies, reach out to those young people, and making sure that they have a way to express themselves, their sadness, their anger, and find support. Because, again, if they take that and then they mix that with a rash, impulsive behavior, it leads to death. and we got to break our silence that our kids have emotional needs, that we got to give them space to be able to learn how to express themselves, to have their feelings, but to recover. And we have to find a way to help our kids recover as they're having these feelings of sadness and anger, and find a way to support them expressing that and recovering from those feelings. And I think too often we don't provide enough spaces, particularly for our males, to recover from their feelings or experiences of anger, sadness, and anxiety. And I don't want to leave off anxiety, because anxiety is really debilitating when you're afraid, and when you have things that you're afraid of, and it really is much more debilitating on the long term than depression, which tends to be more cyclical. So I'm saying that it's important that we find a way to support the emotional health of our children, make sure they have access to care, make sure we as families don't stigmatize, reach people who need emotional care, and connect them, I think, for me personally, to a strong faith base, regardless of what your faith is, connection. Those social connections matter, because the more disconnected our young people are feeling and having those emotional challenges, the higher the risk for suicide.
You mentioned a couple of things that I really want to dig into a little more. One of them being this anxiety piece. I really don't think in our society we even look at anxiety. I know in my life, I look at it as just, it's a normal fear, like, I'm afraid of heights, I don't like spiders. What is the differentiation between just normal fear and this anxiety thing that can really become an issue for people?
So I think, it's the analogy sometimes I draw is someone who's been in combat, so people can understand the distinction, or even thinking about a police officer who's seen real, who's been on the force for a while. Now, these are individuals, if you know of a cop, you'll find that police officers, regardless of whether or not they're on duty or off duty, there's something about them that they're always observing. They're kind of hyper-aroused, right? They're picking up things in the air. They're looking at folks. It's just the normal way that they've come to be. And that hyper-arousal causes them to react very vigilantly to life experiences. So it's similar. It's one way I try to use to illustrate that everyone could go through their day, walk into a room, and not think much about the room or doing anything else that's more cognitively draining. But a person with generalized anxiety disorder or even PTSD, which is another form of anxiety disorder, they coming into that room, their senses are tingling. Their brain is working overtime. Their heart rates are going up. There's a physiological reaction. That's a very different way to live life when you feel that you always got to be concerned, not necessarily fearful at the level of, you see a spider or a snake, or that sort of thing, but your mind is on overdrive because, again, your heart rate is up and it might be uncontrollable to you because, again, you're concerned about your life, your experiences, humility, being ashamed of doing something. You're always hyper aroused. So I think that's the way I would explain it. It's a debilitating way for your brain and mind to be interacting with the world.
Does that come typically from socialization?
I can't say no. I think it's just really a lived experience. Again, the life that they've had, the comments they've received, the trauma they might have received in their life. What we find is that those with anxiety disorder, when we looked at adults and with youth, but more adults, black males, is that having an anxiety disorder was a stronger predictor than having a mood disorder in terms of the risk for suicide attempts. So we know it matters, but we have to do more to try to better understand that sort of hyper-arousal and the painful impact of always being hyper-aroused and on the emotional health of our children. So these are things that we have to look at.
Very good. Something else you mentioned is that the impulsive type behavior behind suicide. And I kind of really want to clear that up because I've heard it in our community where many, someone may say, I'm going to kill myself. They may post something. And then you'll see them days later and, they haven't done it. And many people, they have the approach that, if they were going to do it, they would go ahead and do it as if suicide is this thing that you just do and you don't really announce. Is that always true? Is it something that you do impulsively, or can it be something that you think or meditate on over time and eventually do?
So there's different theories around this, and different ways to think about it. So again, I don't want to put this in just a framework. This is just how it happens to everyone, but there's diversity here. Often we're finding in the literature that the time between someone think about suicide and act on it is usually about 10 minutes on average. So that doesn't mean they've never had what we call suicide ideation. That doesn't mean they never thought about it before. Okay? But it's one thing to think about it, which again is a much more normal thing. Many individuals in this country think about have suicide ideation and never die by suicide at all. Right? So let's reverse it. Is that you have large people who find hope and support and connectedness all over this country, even though they have suicidal thoughts. Or even individuals who have attempted suicide never go on to die that way, because again, there are experiences of hope and connection that's happening that produces much lower levels of suicide than if they weren't happening. However, we tend to see that, again, it's usually something that we might call a trigger, one experience this is the last straw sort of experiences. And if those individuals have that sort of experience and access to lethal means, and this is critical, the difference is between suicidal thinking, having a very, very rough or experience a suicidal crisis, and living is whether or not the person has access to lethal means within that time frame. So someone could really want feeling a level of dread and pain and emotional psychological ache, and if they don't have access to lethal means like a gun, primarily, which results in a 95% chances of fatality, then that experience would subside, and it would find that there's opportunities for recovery and connection and purpose. But if you mix it with a cocktail of firearm availability or lethal means availability, that often would more likely result in death.
Give our listeners some key insights on how to trace this whole, whether or not they may have a son, daughter, or any relative or loved one that's maybe even contemplating. How can they look upon them and maybe, or even just in their encounters, determine whether this may be an issue for them?
Well, I think we have to begin to focus on these warning signs. Someone who's talking about dying or killing themselves, or life is not worth living, I got no purpose. We want to take that seriously. We want to take it seriously to really and develop a level of comfort for ourselves to ask more and to be comfortable asking individuals who you think might be exhibiting warning signs, whether or not they're thinking about taking their lives. But at the same time, you want to prepare yourself for the response when they say yes. And the question is, what do you do? Then you want to be able to have a number, one, that if it's an emergency situation and you think that person has and this is just your own experience, think they might die within the next 24 hours, then you want to be able to call and connect them to one of the lifelines, which is 1-800-273-8255, or another way of saying 1-800-TALK. You want to be able to connect them to sources and resources out there. But people start giving away things, talking hopelessly, talking about their burden to others, who you see them increasing their substance use or acting really agitated and reckless. They're not sleeping much. They're withdrawing themselves. They're showing a lot of rage and anger or just very quick and very pronounced mood swings. These are some of the warning signs that we really have to pay attention to. Also, look if they had a trauma in their life and they had a major loss or actual physical or emotional trauma. These are things to pay attention to if it's coupled with the idea that they're expressing that they feel like a burden, they feel disconnected, they feel hopeless. Again, these are some of the warning signs. But you have to be prepared and comfortable to say, I'd rather ask the question and them being upset with me then not ask them the question. And then 2, be able to connect to a local resource, whether it's a lifeline, as I mentioned, which is one of these 800 numbers, or a local resources in your community. So those are some things I would say to consider.
I'm curious, is there any research that you've done that kind of represents how much of the suicide in our community is mental health related?
Well, yeah, so it depends on youth. It depends on the age, too. Again, the idea is that, again, usually somewhere along the line there is some level of psychiatric illness. So I want to say mental illness, not necessarily that's involved here. But again, someone, there's only 5 to 10% of people who have depression go on to kill themselves. Most people with mental illness do not go on to kill themselves. But of those who do kill themselves, there is a history of mental illness. So that's the challenge with the work. But you can't always look for mental illness. In one study that's nationally representative, we saw that about 50% of the black youth who had a history of suicide attempts did not have a diagnosable mental disorder by the time they attempted their suicide. So you just can't look for adolescents who are showing up in mental health clinics. They're showing up in the Boys and Girls Club. They're showing up in the parks. They're showing up in other spaces. So we all have to be vigilant to pay attention to other warning signs of hopelessness, purposelessness, burdensomeness, and disconnectedness among our young people.
I'm curious if you know of any success stories, and the reason why I go here is because I think in our community, so many people, when they're exposed to this kind of thing, they automatically give up hope, and they just think it's a hopeless situation. Do you have any record of people who have been suicidal and have come out on the other side better?
Well, again, I'm not seeing folks clinically at this moment at all, but there are many stories of young people. The one I always tell is not necessarily a black youth or a black young male, but it was this young man named Kevin Hines many years ago. And Kevin was having a very, he's had a history of psychiatric illness or mental illness. He was suicidal, and he wanted to use the Golden State Bridge. He wanted to jump off of the Golden State Bridge to kill himself. And Kevin on his way was looking, and he said to himself, he was looking for some level of social connection, that if somebody would connect with him, that he's going to decide not to jump. The short of the story is that Kevin eventually jumped off the Golden State Bridge, and instantaneously he realized that he did not want to die, and he survived, and he's been using his life to spread the message out there for those who are thinking about suicide, that there is a chance for recovery and hope. And he shows that God had spared him and allowed him to be a voice, because he himself was feeling this way. And he said, I was looking for connection. I was looking for meaning. I was looking for someone to care about me and to express that. I was looking to see how can I change my life. And I just say there are many more people out there who have been feeling the same way, who are finding connections with friends, families, and we need to reach out to those individuals and are surviving than they are dying. So I say more people are surviving than they are dying.
Very good. Before we get out of here, on the subject of homicide and just everything else that goes along with it, I'm just curious as to your thoughts, and maybe even if you've done any research regarding what has happened in Parkland, Florida, back some weeks ago. Is there anything you can offer from your vantage point?
Well, at this point, my thought is we have to focus on ensuring that our young blacks, particularly young black males, has the support that's necessary to support their social mobility goals and their futures. And I don't want to say that that's just a broad idea. I mean, we have to now dig in. If you want to reduce violence, you have to provide people with real, meaningful opportunities and support along the way. You have to create real, meaningful opportunities, and if you do that, then I think you're not going to see the level of violence that we're seeing in some cities. If you don't do that, then again, the system is working the way it's designed to work, and that's unfortunate. So if you really want to change violence in the United States, one, you got to reduce the access to lethal means, and two, you have to increase the access to real opportunities.
Well, Dr. Joe, I appreciate you joining me. Tell our listeners how they can connect with some of the things you guys have going on.
Well, at the Brown School here in Washington University in St. Louis, if you want to connect with the work that we're doing, we're in the Race and Opportunity Lab, which is raceandopportunity.wustl.edu, to find out about the work that we're doing here at the Brown School, here at Washington University in St. Louis. The more that we speak about these issues, particularly around suicide in our community, and find a way to encourage individuals to seek help for their mental illness, the better off we're going to be. So thank you.
Well, this has been the Build on Beauty podcast, where beauty is born skin deep. I'm your host, Cornell Jermaine. Until next time, let your soul be made whole. Take care.
Thank you for listening to the Build on Beauty podcast. For more information about our host, please visit cornelljermaine.com.